In the heart of Europe, hidden behind discreet facades, 41 palatial estates stood as monuments to a family's secretive power until the world began to tear them down. Imagine walking through an unassuming mansion in the French countryside, only to discover hidden vaults filled with gold, private rail lines snaking between properties, and a vast network of tunnels leading to unseen sanctuaries. This was the Rothschild Empire, a shadow realm where fortunes were made, wars were financed, and history was shaped. These palaces were more than just homes. They were the silent engines of global financial and political power. But what happens when this empire, built on secrecy and excess, begins to unravel? Welcome to the dark story of the Rothschild Mansion Empire. The Rothschilds' hidden blueprint behind every great empire is a vision, and for the Rothschilds, that vision was hidden in plain sight. Mayer Amschel Rothschild understood something fundamental about power in 1770. It wasn't enough to have wealth. You needed places to put it, sanctuaries where it could grow, multiply, and remain invisible to those who might take it away. His 5 sons would carry this understanding across Europe, planting seeds that would bloom into something unprecedented. The blueprint was elegant in its simplicity. Nathan in London, James in Paris, Salomon in Vienna, Karl in Naples, Amschel in Frankfurt, 5 brothers, 5 cities, 5 fortunes that moved like blood through the veins of a continent. But the true genius wasn't in the banks they established. It was in the homes they built around them. By 1840, the Rothschild family had begun acquiring properties with surgical precision. Each estate served a purpose beyond mere residence. They were nodes in a network, carefully positioned along trade routes, near political centers, within reach of royal courts. A mansion in the English countryside meant access to Parliament. A palace in Vienna meant whispers from the Habsburg court. A chateau outside Paris meant influence over French military strategy. The family didn't advertise their acquisitions. They moved quietly. A purchase here, an inheritance there. Land accumulated like interest, silently compounding. By 1870, the Rothschilds controlled more private property across Europe than many minor nobility. And unlike those nobles, they paid for it all in cash. The estates served as more than symbols of wealth. They were operational headquarters, private meeting spaces where financial negotiations occurred away from public scrutiny, where loans to governments were discussed over dinner, where the fate of nations was debated in drawing rooms lined with Renaissance art. Each property connected to the others through an invisible web of communication. Carrier pigeons first, then telegraph lines. Messages traveled between London and Paris faster through Rothschild channels than through official postal systems. Information was currency, and the family hoarded it like gold. The obsession with privacy shaped every decision. High walls, gated entrances, staff selected for loyalty above all else. Visitors were carefully vetted, their names recorded, their movements monitored. The Rothschilds understood that true power required discretion. The moment wealth became visible, it became vulnerable. Nathan Rothschild once said he could calculate the value of a nation by studying the faces of its ministers. But he did this calculation from his estate at Gunnersbury Park, not from a bank office. The mansion allowed him to blur the line between social visits and financial negotiations. Guests never knew if they were attending a dinner party or a business meeting. Usually, it was both. The blueprint demanded everything: endless capital for land purchases, constant maintenance of multiple properties, an army of servants sworn to silence. security systems that bordered on paranoia. But the family never wavered. They built their empire one estate at a time, brick by careful brick. By the turn of the century, the strategy had evolved. The Rothschilds weren't just buying existing properties anymore. They were commissioning new ones. Palaces designed from the ground up to serve their purposes. Buildings that looked modest from the street, but sprawled endlessly behind their gates. Structures that appeared to be simple country homes, but contained rooms that would make emperors weep with envy. The vision that began with Mayor Amschel had metastasized into something far grander than even he could have imagined. His descendants weren't simply wealthy. They had woven themselves into the architecture of Europe itself. Their homes had become the hidden framework upon which the continent's power structure balanced. And the world had no idea how deep the foundation really went. The architects of secrecy. The buildings themselves were designed to deceive, beautiful on the outside, yet utterly deceptive in their design. Walk past a Rothschild estate in 1890. You might see a handsome but unremarkable manor house, stone facade, classical columns, gardens that spoke of good taste but not ostentation. You would never guess what lay beneath your feet. The architects who designed these properties signed contracts that included clauses about secrecy. They were paid handsomely, often double their usual fees. In exchange, they agreed never to discuss the full scope of their work. Many didn't even know what they were building. One team designed the public rooms, another constructed the basements, a third installed security features. The plans were never complete, never held by a single person. Joseph Paxton, who designed the Crystal Palace, also designed parts of Mentmore Towers for Baron Mayer de Rothschild. But the public plans showed only a fraction of the actual structure. Beneath the grand entrance hall, workers excavated chambers that never appeared in official documents. Stone masons built walls within walls. Carpenters installed doors that opened onto passages leading nowhere on any map. The deception started at ground level. Reception rooms displayed wealth, but carefully calibrated wealth. Expensive, yes, but not shockingly so. Art on the walls was valuable, but not priceless. Furniture was fine, but not extravagant. The message was clear: we are successful, but we are not different from you. Everything changed below stairs. Service corridors connected to private railways. Wine cellars opened into document vaults. Storage rooms concealed entrances to tunnels that ran for hundreds of meters underground. The Rothschilds built an entire infrastructure of secrecy beneath the polite surface of their homes. At Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild commissioned a French chateau that seemed transplanted from the Loire Valley. Visitors marveled at its beauty. They didn't notice the unusually deep foundations. The basement levels that went down, 3 stories instead of 1. The private railway platform hidden behind a grove of trees, allowing family members to arrive and depart without using public stations. The estate's water tower, a decorative feature visible for miles, contained more than water. Its upper levels housed communication equipment. Telegraph operators worked in shifts, maintaining contact with other Rothschild properties. Messages arrived in code. They were decoded in the tower, then carried through underground passages directly to the main house. No messenger ever walked the public drive with a telegram. Security obsessed every designer. Windows in sensitive areas used special glass that distorted views from outside, while allowing perfect visibility from within. Door locks employed mechanisms that required 3 separate keys, each held by different staff members. Staircases included false steps that could trip intruders in darkness. The Rothschilds thought of everything. Vaults presented the greatest design, challenge. They needed to be absolutely secure, yet quickly accessible to family members. The solution involved multiple layers of protection. The first vault door looked impressive, but protected relatively little. Behind it lay a second door, hidden in what appeared to be a simple storage alcove. Beyond that, a third entrance, concealed behind a sliding stone panel in the floor. The innermost chambers contained wealth that defied calculation. Gold coins stacked from floor to ceiling. Bearer bonds representing millions in liquid assets. Jewels sorted by type and value. Documents proving ownership of properties, businesses, and debt instruments across a dozen countries. Insurance policies, title deeds, marriage contracts, wills, the paper trail of an empire. Some vaults connected to others through narrow tunnels. If one estate came under threat, valuables could be moved through underground passages to another property kilometers away. The Rothschilds planned for every contingency, including invasion, revolution, and persecution. Their grandparents had lived through all three. This generation would not be caught unprepared. Art galleries served double purposes. Yes, they displayed masterpieces, but the rooms themselves could be sealed from the inside. Heavy doors, disguised as decorative panels, could be closed and locked in seconds. If the house was ever raided, the art collection would be protected behind barriers strong enough to withstand battering rams. The gardens, too, concealed infrastructure. Ornamental lakes provided reservoirs for firefighting. Decorative grottos hid ventilation shafts for underground chambers. Hedge mazes included passages that led to escape routes. Beauty and function merged seamlessly. Every element served multiple purposes. Staff quarters included observation posts. Servants watched visitors from concealed positions. They noted conversations, recorded unusual behavior, reported everything to the head of household security. The Rothschilds trusted no one completely. Even honored guests moved through an environment of total surveillance. The deception worked because it was absolute. Visitors saw what they expected to see. Wealth, certainly, but not threatening wealth. Not the kind of wealth that demanded explanation or investigation. The Rothschilds hid their empire inside the architecture itself. By the time anyone realized how much was concealed, the family had already moved to the next level of secrecy. The buildings kept their secrets for generations. Some still do. The dream that demanded everything. By the turn of the 20th century, the Rothschilds had built more than 40 palaces across Europe. But at what cost? The numbers alone staggered comprehension. 41 estates, 3,000 servants, 160 gardeners, 84 gamekeepers, private fire brigades at 7 properties, dedicated railway platforms at 12, over 15,000 acres of manicured grounds requiring constant maintenance. The annual operating cost exceeded the gross domestic product of several small European nations. Baron Edmond de Rothschild spent 17 years building his chateau at Boulogne-Billancourt. Every detail received his personal attention. He interviewed stonemasons individually. He approved paint colors for rooms he would rarely enter. He spent entire afternoons debating the placement of a single fountain. His wife begged him to finish. His children barely remembered a time when their father wasn't consumed by construction. The obsession consumed more than time. It devoured family relationships. Fathers missed birthdays because they were inspecting properties in distant cities. Mothers spent months away from children, overseeing renovations. Marriages strained under the weight of maintaining an empire that demanded constant attention. The houses required more care than the people living in them. Staff turnover became a crisis. Running a Rothschild estate meant absolute dedication. Footmen worked 16-hour days. Housemaids began at 5 in the morning and finished after midnight. Cooks prepared meals for dozens without knowing who might actually attend dinner. The physical toll broke even the strongest workers. Most lasted less than 3 years. Finding replacements who could maintain secrecy while enduring such conditions proved increasingly difficult. The financial burden grew exponentially. Each estate needed not just servants, but specialists. Art restorers for the galleries, armorers for the weapon collections, librarians for private collections that rivaled national libraries, mechanics for the automobiles, engineers for the private railways, locksmiths for the vaults, telegraphers for communication systems. The payroll for a single property often exceeded £150,000 annually. Then came the maintenance. Roofs needed constant repair. Foundations settled and cracked. Plumbing failed. Heating systems broke down. A modest rainstorm could cause thousands of pounds in damage. A harsh winter meant frozen pipes throughout entire wings. The estates aged faster than anticipated. What looked solid often hid spreading decay. Fixing one problem revealed 3 more. The houses consumed capital like furnaces consumed coal. Security costs escalated as political tensions rose. Each estate required guards, not just groundskeepers who happened to carry weapons, but trained security personnel, former soldiers, men who understood tactical defense. They needed uniforms, weapons, training, and salaries that reflected the risk they assumed. A single estate might employ 20 guards. Multiply that across 41 properties. The numbers became unsustainable. Insurance presented another nightmare. Underwriters refused to cover the true value of what the Rothschilds owned. The art alone exceeded what most insurance companies could pay if destroyed. The family essentially self-insured, setting aside enormous reserves against potential loss. Capital that could have generated returns instead sat idle, waiting for disasters that might never come. The dream had become a trap. Selling estates would signal weakness. Consolidating would mean abandoning the network that made the properties valuable in the first place. But maintaining everything meant pouring money into assets that generated no direct return. The houses were supposed to be tools of power. They had become monuments to excess. Family meetings grew bitter. Younger Rothschilds questioned the wisdom of their elders. Why maintain a chateau in France that no one had visited in 5 years? Why employ 30 gardeners for grounds that only hosted parties twice annually? Why keep apartments in Vienna when the family spent most of their time in London? The arguments exposed fundamental disagreements about what the empire was for. Some family members wanted to modernize, turn estates into actual businesses, rent out properties for events, open galleries to the public for admission fees, commercialize what previous generations had kept private. The idea horrified the traditionalists. Rothschilds didn't rent their homes to strangers. They didn't charge admission to view their art. To do so would be to admit that the empire had become a burden rather than an asset. Yet the burden grew heavier every year. Taxes increased as governments needed revenue for military buildups. Labor costs rose as workers organized and demanded better conditions. Materials became more expensive as Europe's economy shifted toward industrial production. The same economic forces that had built Rothschild wealth now worked against their estate empire. Personal toll matched financial pressure. Baron Henri de Rothschild suffered a nervous breakdown trying to manage renovations at 3 properties simultaneously. Lady Charlotte de Rothschild spent her final years obsessed with a garden design at Gunnersbury that would never be completed. Family members developed illnesses that doctors attributed to stress. The dream demanded everything, including their health. By 1910, even the most optimistic Rothschilds recognized reality. The empire had grown beyond any reasonable scale. It consumed more than it provided. It demanded more attention than it deserved. But no one knew how to stop. Momentum carried them forward. Pride prevented retreat. The houses stood, magnificent and terrible, monuments to a dream that had become a nightmare. The question was no longer whether they could maintain the empire. It was whether they wanted to. When the numbers stopped making sense. As the empire grew, so did the debts, and soon, even the Rothschilds could no longer hide the truth. The accounting books told a story the family didn't want to hear. In 1900, the combined operating costs of all Rothschild estates exceeded £2.3 million annually. By 1910, that figure had climbed to 3.7 million. Revenue generated from the banking operations was immense, certainly, but the houses consumed an increasing percentage of total profit. What once represented 5% of annual income now approached 20%. Ferdinand de Rothschild kept meticulous records. His personal ledgers revealed the impossible mathematics of maintaining Waddesdon Manor. The estate employed 247 full-time staff. Weekly wages, £860. Annual salaries for senior staff, £93,000. Maintenance and repairs, £112,000. Heating costs alone, £18,000. Gardens and grounds, £76,000. The property operated at a loss of approximately £120,000 every year. Other estates showed similar patterns. Ferrières, the vast chateau outside Paris, required 300 servants and cost over £150,000 annually to maintain. Mentmore Towers needed constant repairs that averaged £80,000 each year. Even smaller properties like Villa Efroussi in the south of France demanded £40,000 yearly. The numbers didn't just fail to make sense. They made a mockery of traditional economics. The Rothschilds were caught in a trap of their own making. The estates existed to project power, but power required visibility. Visibility required grandeur. Grandeur demanded maintenance. Maintenance consumed capital. The circle was vicious and unbreakable. Worse, the properties were essentially illiquid. You couldn't sell a Rothschild palace the way you might sell a townhouse. Potential buyers were limited to a handful of aristocrats or newly wealthy industrialists. Most lacked the resources to purchase the estate and the operational budget to maintain it. Even when buyers emerged, selling a property meant weakening the network that made the others valuable. A connected empire was worth maintaining. A fragmented collection was merely expensive real estate. Some family members proposed radical solutions: rent unused properties to European nobility, convert estates into hotels, transform galleries into public museums with admission fees. Each suggestion met fierce resistance from traditionalists who saw such ideas as betraying the family's core principles. Rothschilds didn't commercialize their privacy. They didn't turn their sanctuaries into businesses. But the alternative was equally unacceptable. Keep bleeding capital until the drain became unsustainable. Watch as maintenance backlogs grew. See the properties slowly deteriorate. The empire couldn't survive indefinitely on sentiment and pride. The problem extended beyond simple operating costs. Many estates had been expanded during boom years with borrowed capital, secured against other properties, or expected future returns. In good economic times, these debts were manageable. But Europe's economy was becoming increasingly unstable. Political tensions between great powers created uncertainty. Investment returns fluctuated wildly. The steady, predictable growth that had characterized the 19th century was giving way to volatility. Property taxes presented another escalating burden. Governments needed revenue for naval buildups, colonial administration, and social programs. The enormous estates owned by wealthy families represented obvious targets for taxation. Britain introduced graduated estate duties. France increased property assessments. Germany imposed new inheritance taxes that specifically targeted large holdings. The Rothschilds fought these measures politically, but the trend was clear. The age of vast private estates supported by minimal taxation was ending. Insurance costs rose alongside other expenses. Companies that once covered Rothschild properties for reasonable premiums now demanded rates that reflected the true replacement value of buildings and contents. A fire at Waddesdon would cost millions to remediate. Theft of the art collection would bankrupt most insurers. The family's response was to self-insure, which meant setting aside reserves that could otherwise generate returns. Dead capital accumulated in accounts, waiting for disasters. Staff costs couldn't be reduced without sacrificing the service standards that defined Rothschild estates. A grand house required an enormous staff. Fewer servants meant visible decline in quality. Gardens would grow wild. Rooms would accumulate dust. Meals would be less elaborate. Visitors would notice. The family would appear to be struggling. For the Rothschilds, that appearance was more dangerous than the actual financial pressure. Their power rested partly on the perception of limitless resources. Some properties became financial black holes. Villa Rothschild in Grasse required 2 major renovations within 15 years, each costing over £60,000. The Hotel Salomon de Rothschild in Paris needed a complete overhaul of its heating and plumbing systems at a cost of £90,000. Château de Prigny in Switzerland experienced foundation problems that took 7 years and £140,000 to address. These weren't improvements. They were emergency repairs to prevent buildings from becoming uninhabitable. The younger generation viewed the crisis with clearer eyes. They had grown up watching their parents and grandparents pour wealth into properties that gave little back beyond prestige. They saw the stress. They felt the burden. They questioned the wisdom of continuing the pattern. But they also understood that unwinding the empire would be nearly as expensive as maintaining it. Breaking up the network meant selling in a buyer's market. It meant taking losses. It meant admitting defeat. Family meetings became exercises in denial. Senior members insisted the crisis was temporary. Once political tensions eased, property values would rise. Once the European economy stabilized, operating costs would moderate. Once they implemented more efficient management systems, the bleeding would stop. The future always looked brighter in these discussions. The present remained stubbornly dire. The evidence mounted in ledgers that few family members wanted to examine closely. The empire was consuming itself, not quickly, not obviously, but steadily, year after year. The mathematics grew worse. The houses that were supposed to be the family's greatest achievement had become its heaviest burden, and no one knew how to escape the weight. The silent wars. They funded. As Europe descended into war, the Rothschilds were quietly financing both sides of the conflict. The drawing room at Waddesdon Manor witnessed a conversation on August 3rd, 1914, that few history books recorded. Lord Rothschild sat across from two representatives of the British War Office. They needed money, enormous amounts, immediately. The next day, Britain would formally enter the war. Within a week, hundreds of thousands of soldiers would need uniforms, weapons, food, and transportation. The government's coffers couldn't cover costs of that magnitude on such short notice. The Rothschilds could, and did. Within 48 hours, the family arranged loans totaling £3 million to the British government. The funds came from reserves held across multiple estates, consolidated through the private communication network that connected the properties. No public announcement, no press coverage, just capital flowing silently from private vaults into government accounts. But Britain wasn't the only beneficiary of Rothschild financing. That same week, the Vienna branch of the family met with Austro-Hungarian officials. They too needed immediate capital. The empire was mobilizing against Serbia. Soldiers, supplies, ammunition, all required funding. The Austrian Rothschilds opened their vaults. In Paris, the French government approached Baron Edmond with similar desperation. France needed money to mobilize. Could the family help? Of course. Loans were arranged. Terms were generous by wartime standards. The pattern repeated across Europe, Germany, Russia, Italy. Each side in the coming conflict received financial support from different branches of the same family. The moral complexity was staggering. Rothschild money would buy bullets that killed soldiers on both sides. Their capital would fund battles where cousins potentially faced each other across trenches. The family dinner table included members who were technically financing enemies. Yet they continued. The justification was always the same. Banking was business. Countries needed capital. The Rothschilds provided it. Personal feelings couldn't interfere with financial operations. Each branch operated independently, making decisions based on national interests and business opportunities. That the family name appeared on both sides of the ledger was simply how international finance worked. The estates served as more than banks during the war. They became informal meeting places where sensitive negotiations occurred away from official channels. At Ferrières, French military officials met with Rothschild representatives to discuss supply chain logistics. The chateau's private railway moved materiel without using public transportation networks. Goods arrived, were cataloged in outbuildings, then shipped directly to depots near the front lines. The estate functioned as a quasi-official supply hub. In England, similar patterns emerged. Waddesdon's grounds hosted training exercises for new regiments. The private railway platform allowed military personnel to arrive and depart without using crowded public stations. Meetings between war planners occurred in rooms filled with priceless art, discussions of death surrounded by beauty. The juxtaposition never ceased to disturb. The profits were extraordinary. War loans carried premium interest rates that reflected risk and urgency. Governments desperate for capital accepted terms they would have rejected in peacetime. The Rothschilds weren't gouging, exactly, but they weren't offering charity either. Every loan generated returns. Every transaction added to the family's wealth, even as Europe tore itself apart. Some family members felt profound unease. Baron Henri de Rothschild, who had become a doctor, spent the war treating wounded soldiers. He saw firsthand what the financed guns and bombs did to human bodies. He returned from field hospitals to family estates, where the wealth enabling that destruction was counted and allocated. The contradiction haunted him. He would later write in private letters that the war had broken something fundamental in his understanding of the family's role in the world. Others felt no such ambiguity. Banking was a profession. Wars were political affairs. The Rothschilds provided financial services. What governments did with borrowed capital was beyond their responsibility. This view dominated family councils. Sentiment couldn't be allowed to interfere with business operations. The banks had survived for generations by maintaining neutrality. Emotion was dangerous in finance. The network of estates became crucial to wartime operations. Communication between properties allowed information to flow faster than through official channels. The Rothschilds often knew about military developments before governments announced them publicly. This intelligence had financial value. Knowing which way a battle had turned allowed them to adjust investment positions before markets reacted. The estates weren't just beautiful buildings. They were nodes in an information network that generated enormous advantage. Vaults that once held gold now held war bonds. Instead of jewels, the hidden chambers contained securities representing debt obligations from multiple combatant nations. The Rothschilds effectively bet on all outcomes. Whoever won, the family would hold paper from the victor. The strategy was brilliant in its amorality. Support everyone. Guarantee returns regardless of military results. Let nations destroy each other while you hold their IOUs. Some properties suffered direct impact. Chateau Rothschild in Boulogne-sur-Mer was requisitioned by French military authorities. The building became a temporary hospital. Soldiers recuperated in rooms once reserved for elite guests. Blood-stained carpets that had cost fortunes. Priceless furniture was damaged by heavy use. The family filed claims for damages. They received partial compensation years later, far below actual losses. Austrian estates fared worse. The war devastated Central Europe. Several Rothschild properties in Austria and Poland were damaged by fighting. Villa Rothschild in Gmunden was used as a military headquarters, then abandoned when the front shifted. Looters took what they could carry. Weather destroyed what remained. The family would never fully recover these losses, yet the banking operations thrived. By 1918, the various Rothschild houses had lent over £50 million to European governments. Interest payments would continue for decades. The war that killed millions had made the family wealthier. The mathematics were undeniable. So was the moral calculus. The Rothschilds had financed industrialized slaughter on an unprecedented scale. They would never be able to escape that legacy. When the armistice finally came, the family gathered at Ferrières for the first time in 4 years. Cousins who had been separated by battle lines reunited. They didn't discuss the war directly. Instead, they talked about the estates, which needed repairs, which could be sold, which still served their purpose. The conversation was practical, focused on property and finance. Beneath the business talk lay something unspoken, a shared knowledge that they had participated in something monstrous, that their beautiful palaces had been stained by the proceeds of financing mass death. The houses stood, as always, silent, magnificent, and utterly compromised. Tunnels of wealth, vaults of power beneath the elegant facades, the Rothschilds built a subterranean empire of vaults, secret rooms, and hidden railways. The tunnels at Waddesdon Manor ran for almost 3 kilometers. Not service corridors for staff, not simple wine cellars. Actual tunnels, tall enough for a man to walk upright, wide enough for 2 to pass comfortably. They connected the main house to the railway platform, to outbuildings, to concealed exits in distant woods. Brick-lined, gas-lit, perfectly engineered, and entirely secret. No architectural plans showed these passages. Construction workers signed contracts forbidding them from discussing what they built. Different teams excavated different sections. No one except the Rothschilds and their most trusted engineers knew the full extent of the underground network. The earth itself kept their secrets. Baron de Couturnes, Ferdinand personally supervised tunnel construction. He descended into excavations weekly, checking progress, examining workmanship. His obsession with detail was legendary. He rejected bricks if their color wasn't perfectly uniform. He demanded that tunnel floors be absolutely level. He insisted on ventilation systems that would keep the air fresh for hours. These weren't temporary wartime measures. They were permanent infrastructure meant to last centuries. The vaults presented even greater engineering challenges. The main vault beneath Waddesdon descended 4 levels underground. Each level required progressively more elaborate security. The first level contained items of moderate value: family silver, document archives, insurance policies, items that were valuable but replaceable. This level could be accessed relatively easily by senior household staff. The second level held serious wealth: gold coins sorted by nation and date, bearer bonds representing millions in liquid assets, jewelry that had belonged to European royalty, art too valuable to display publicly. Access required 3 keys held by different family members. The door was steel, nearly 30 centimeters thick, set into a reinforced concrete frame. Forcing entry would take explosives powerful enough to collapse the entire structure. The third level was smaller, more selective. Here sat items whose value transcended money. Documents proving ownership of properties across Europe, letters from monarchs, treaties bearing royal seals, evidence of loans to governments, political intelligence that could destroy careers or start wars. This level had a time lock. It could only be opened during specific hours on specific days. Even family members couldn't access it on impulse. The fourth level was a room of legends. Family members whispered about it, but few had ever entered. Some claimed it held the accumulated gold reserves of 3 generations. Others insisted it contained blackmail material on every major European leader. A few believed it was empty, a decoy to misdirect potential thieves. The truth remained elusive. Baron Ferdinand took that secret to his grave. Similar systems existed at other major estates. Ferrières had vaults that ran 6 levels deep. The lowest chamber could only be reached by descending through passages that flooded with water if tampered with. The engineering was brilliant. The paranoia was absolute. Private railways connected many estates to public rail lines without using public stations. At Waddesdon, the platform sat hidden in a grove of trees, invisible from nearby roads. Family members could arrive directly from London without being seen in any public space. They stepped from private rail cars into private grounds without ever exposing themselves to observation. The same system allowed valuable cargo to move between properties without appearing in shipping manifests or customs records. Mentmore Towers included a railway tunnel that ran directly under the house. Trains could pull beneath the main structure, unload in complete privacy, then depart without ever being visible from above ground. Goods moved through underground passages into the house proper. Visitors could arrive, spend days as guests, then leave without any public record of their presence. The system made the estate effectively invisible to surveillance. The Jewish community maintained a special place in Rothschild planning. Many estates included tunnels leading to nearby synagogues, not obvious passages, hidden routes that provided emergency escape if persecution erupted. The family remembered pogroms. They planned for the possibility of having to flee. The tunnels leading to religious sanctuaries reflected both faith and fear, a way to worship safely, a way to escape if worship became dangerous. Some passages connected multiple estates. Rumors persisted of a tunnel running between the Paris Mansion and Ferrières, a distance of over 30 kilometers. Officially, this was impossible. The engineering required would have been staggering. Costs would have been prohibitive. Yet workers who claimed to have participated in such construction occasionally surfaced. They described years of excavation, crews working from both ends, a meeting point somewhere beneath the French countryside where two tunnels joined. The Rothschilds never confirmed or denied these stories. Ambiguity served their purposes. Communication systems throughout the underground networks allowed different sections to stay in contact. Speaking tubes ran alongside tunnels. A person in the vault could communicate with someone at the railway platform without leaving their position. In an emergency, this capability would be crucial. In daily operations, it simply made the massive estates more manageable. The Rothschilds stored more than gold in their vaults. Documentation filled entire chambers. Genealogical records traced family lineage back centuries. Business ledgers recorded every major transaction for generations. Title deeds proved ownership of properties. Marriage contracts preserved alliances with other powerful families. Wills stipulated the distribution of assets across multiple nations. The paper trail of empire filled hundreds of filing cabinets, all carefully organized and meticulously maintained. Art presented special storage challenges. Some pieces were too valuable to display openly, too controversial, too likely to attract theft. These works lived underground. Climate-controlled chambers maintained perfect temperature and humidity. Conservators visited regularly to check for deterioration. The collection hidden in vaults rivaled what hung on gallery walls above. Masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Titian that the public would never see. Wealth that existed only for family eyes. During World War I, the tunnels proved their worth. When estates were requisitioned for military use, the vaults remained secure. Soldiers occupied buildings, but never discovered what lay beneath their feet. Art was moved through underground passages to safer properties. Documents disappeared into hidden chambers. By the time military authorities thought to search for valuables, they found empty rooms and bare walls. The truly important items had vanished through tunnels into safety. Yet rumors circulated, servants gossiped, construction workers talked despite contracts forbidding it. Stories spread about the underground empire. Most people dismissed the tales as fantasy. Secret railways, multi-level vaults, tunnels connecting cities, too elaborate, too expensive, too paranoid. The dismissal was exactly what the Rothschilds hoped for. Let people think the stories were exaggerations. Let reality hide behind disbelief. But some believed. Intelligence services in multiple nations kept files on Rothschild properties. They suspected the estates contained more than appeared. They attempted surveillance. They recruited informants among staff. They learned fragments of truth, never enough to act on, never enough to prove, just enough to know that something vast and hidden existed beneath those beautiful buildings. And then the Nazis began searching in earnest. What they would discover would exceed even the darkest speculation. The underground empire was real, vast, filled with wealth beyond comprehension. and it was all about to be laid bare. The Nazi seizure. In the 1930s, the Nazis found the Rothschilds' hidden wealth, but what they uncovered was more than just treasure. The letter arrived at Château de Ferrières on March 14, 1940. It was typed on official German Reich stationery. The language was bureaucratic, but the message was clear. The property was being seized. The family had 72 hours to evacuate. All contents would be inventoried and claimed by the state. Resistance would be met with immediate arrest. Compliance offered the possibility, though not the guarantee, of survival. Baron Robert de Rothschild read the letter 3 times. Then he began destroying documents. Not everything. That would be impossible. But the most sensitive materials, evidence of loans to governments, political correspondence, intelligence files, anything that could be used against family members or their associates. Papers burned in the chateau's fireplaces for 2 days straight. Smoke rose from chimneys in volumes that attracted attention from villagers. They watched, but didn't understand. The empire was being erased 1 page at a time. On March 17th, German officers arrived. Not ordinary soldiers. A special unit trained in art acquisition and asset seizure. They brought appraisers, accountants, and security personnel. The occupation of Ferrières wasn't military, it was economic. A corporate takeover enforced at gunpoint. The discovery of the first vault took 3 hours. Workers followed plans provided by a former employee who had been persuaded to cooperate. The steel door presented a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. Cutting torches burned through metal. The door fell away. Inside, they found approximately £4 million worth of gold coins, stacked floor to ceiling, sorted by nation and denomination. More precious metal than most banks held. And this was just the first level. The second vault required 2 days to breach. Security systems had been designed to resist exactly this kind of forced entry. Multiple doors, reinforced chambers, time locks that refused to override. The Germans brought in engineers. They studied the mechanisms. They calculated the best approach. When the vault finally opened, they found art that left even experienced appraisers speechless. Paintings worth millions, sculpture dating back to ancient Rome, decorative pieces that belonged in museums, not private collections. The inventory process would take weeks. Other estates fell in similar fashion. Villa Rothschild in Frankfurt was seized in 1938, years before the war began. The family had already fled, but left much behind. Nazis found records going back to Meyer Amschel himself. Banking ledgers, client lists, documentation of loans and investments spanning continents. The papers revealed the full scope of Rothschild financial operations. Networks that extended to America, to England, to the Middle East. The Nazis photographed everything. They built dossiers. They traced connections. At Mentmore Towers in England, the family scrambled to protect assets before German invasion seemed possible. Artworks were moved to remote properties. Documents were shipped to Canada. Gold reserves were transferred to New York. The Rothschilds had learned from their continental cousins. They understood what seizure meant. They acted while they still could. The British government, desperate for dollars to fund the war effort, pressured the family to liquidate some holdings. Not seizure, exactly, but forced sales at disadvantageous prices. The result differed little from confiscation. In Vienna, the story turned darker. Baron Louis de Rothschild was arrested in March 1938, the same day German troops entered Austria. He was held for ransom. Not money, precisely. The Nazis wanted his industrial holdings, his steel works, his mining operations, his railways, assets worth tens of millions of pounds. Baron Louis negotiated from prison for over a year. Finally, in May 1939, he signed away his Austrian empire. In exchange, he was allowed to leave. He fled to England with nothing but his life. The vaults beneath Austrian properties revealed secrets the Nazis hadn't expected, not just wealth, evidence of political manipulation spanning decades. Letters between Rothschild family members discussing loans that had financed wars. Correspondence with government officials arranging terms that favored the family. Documentation of intelligence networks that operated across borders. The Nazis published some of these findings, twisting their meaning for propaganda purposes. They portrayed the Rothschilds as puppet masters controlling European affairs. The propaganda was grotesque in its anti-Semitism. It was also based on documents the Rothschilds themselves had created. Some properties were destroyed rather than surrendered. When the family realized Chateau Rothschild in Boulogne would be seized, they authorized its burning. Better destroyed than Nazi-controlled. Fire consumed the structure overnight. By morning, only the stone facade remained. Vaults beneath the ruins were looted later by treasure hunters, but the house itself was beyond salvaging. The family chose obliteration over occupation. Not all family members escaped. Some, like Baron Louis, paid enormous ransoms. Others weren't as fortunate. Some lost more than property and had to flee to countries that didn't want the burden of wealthy refugees. The physical empire crumbled quickly once systematic seizure began. What had taken 70 years to build came apart in less than 5. Property by property, vault by vault. The Nazis dismantled the visible structure of Rothschild power. But they never found everything. Some vaults remained undiscovered. Some tunnels were never mapped. Loyal servants hid items before German troops arrived. Art was moved to private homes. Documents were buried in gardens. Gold was shipped to Switzerland through channels the Nazis never detected. The seizure was massive but incomplete. Pieces of the empire survived in fragments, scattered and hidden. The psychological impact exceeded the material losses. Estates that had stood for generations fell in weeks. Properties that symbolized permanence proved utterly vulnerable. The Rothschilds had always believed wealth provided security. The Nazi seizures demonstrated how fragile that security really was. Power, they discovered, required more than money. It required the consent of the society around you. When that consent evaporated, all the gold in all the vaults couldn't protect you. Some family members never recovered emotionally. Baron Robert, who had burned documents at Ferrières, spent his remaining years haunted by what he had lost. Not the money. The family still had enormous wealth, but the continuity, the physical connection to previous generations, the places where his ancestors had lived and worked, those were gone, seized, occupied, destroyed. He died in 1946, broken by the war that had taken his world. The estates that survived seizure faced a different fate. Waddesdon was used by the Royal Air Force for officer accommodation. Soldiers walked halls once reserved for royalty. Military boots wore away carpets that had cost fortunes. The property survived the war, but bore scars that would never fully heal. When the family finally reclaimed it in 1946, they found a building that was structurally sound, but spiritually exhausted. The house had aged decades in 6 years. In Paris, Hôtel Salomon de Rothschild became headquarters for German occupation authorities. They hosted parties in its ballrooms. They stored art looted from other Jewish families in its galleries. They used Rothschild property to celebrate their conquest of Rothschild people. The irony was not lost on the occupiers. They documented it all in photographs that would later serve as evidence of their crimes. When Nazi officers finally opened the deepest vault at Ferrières, they found something unexpected. Not gold, not art. A room lined with photographs, thousands of them, images of every major estate, every significant property, complete documentation of the empire at its peak. The Rothschilds had created an archive of their own glory. The Nazis had discovered a monument to everything they were destroying. They boxed up the photographs, shipped them to Berlin, filed them as evidence in cases that would never be tried. The images survived the war. The buildings they depicted did not. The Rothschilds' last stand. As their empire crumbled, the Rothschilds fought fiercely to retain control of their remaining estates. Paris, August 1944. Allied forces were days from liberating the city. Baron Guy de Rothschild crouched in a cellar 3 blocks from the Hotel Salomon de Rothschild. He had returned to the city illegally, traveling with false papers, driven by a single obsession. He would reclaim the family mansion the moment German troops withdrew. Not wait for official processes, not trust authorities to protect Rothschild interests. He would personally take possession. The risk was extraordinary. German soldiers still patrolled streets. Resistance fighters and Wehrmacht units fought sporadic gun battles. Anyone caught without proper identification faced execution. But Guy had spent 4 years in exile, watching the empire dissolve. No more. This property, at least, would return to family control immediately. August 25th. The Germans fled. Chaos filled Paris. Guy emerged from hiding and walked directly to the mansion. He found the doors locked. German officers had departed hours earlier, taking what they could carry. Guy broke a window, climbed inside, stood in the entrance hall of his family's home. Broken furniture littered floors. Walls showed damage from hasty removal of artwork. But the building stood. It could be reclaimed. He spent that night in the mansion alone. No electricity, no water, no furniture beyond what the Germans had left behind. He sat in darkness and made plans. Which rooms needed immediate repair? Which security measures needed implementation? How to prevent looters from stripping what remained? He would restore this property, whatever it cost, however long it required. The Rothschilds would not surrender all they had built. Other family members made similar stands elsewhere. In England, Victor Rothschild battled government bureaucracy to retain Waddesdon. The estate had been requisitioned during the war. Now peace was declared. The family wanted their property returned, but the government viewed the massive estate as a potential public asset. Why should one family control such resources? Couldn't it serve better purposes as a hospital, a school, or a national museum? Victor fought the proposal for 3 years. He hired lawyers. He lobbied politicians. He reminded officials that Waddesdon had been loaned to the war effort voluntarily. The family had accepted minimal compensation. Now the government talked of permanent seizure. The argument was partly about property rights, mostly about dignity. The Rothschilds would not be bullied by bureaucrats after surviving Nazi occupation. The battle consumed Victor's energy and his health. He developed stomach problems that doctors attributed to stress. His wife begged him to compromise, accept partial ownership, donate sections to the National Trust, preserve something rather than risk losing everything. Victor refused. The Fee estate would remain fully under family control. or he would fight until the courts made their final ruling. Pride mattered more than peace. He won. In 1948, the government returned Waddesdon completely to Rothschild ownership. Victor had prevailed through sheer persistence, but the victory felt hollow. The estate was damaged, staff had scattered, gardens were overgrown. Restoring the property to its pre-war condition would cost a fortune and take years. He had won the right to shoulder an enormous burden. In Austria, the situation was more complex. Properties seized by the Nazis had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Baron Louis, who had escaped in 1939, returned in 1947 to survey what remained. Almost nothing. Buildings were rubble. Vaults had been looted. Grounds were abandoned. Even the railways connecting properties had been torn up for scrap metal. The empire he had known no longer existed in any meaningful form. He did recover some items. Art that had been stored in German warehouses. Documents that had been filed as evidence in war crimes trials. Gold that had somehow survived. But these were fragments, pieces of a whole that could never be reassembled. Austrian authorities complicated matters by claiming war reparations against Rothschild properties. The family had fled, they argued. The properties had been abandoned. The state had a right to compensation for war damages. Baron Louis fought these claims, but with limited energy. He was 70 years old. The fight had gone out of him. The French estates presented the greatest challenge. Some had been seized, some destroyed, some occupied, all damaged. Baron Edmond, who had built Château de Ferrières with such care, returned to find it gutted. Nazis had removed anything valuable. Local looters had taken what remained. The building was structurally sound, but spiritually dead. Walking through empty rooms, Edmund wept. Not quietly, not with dignity. He collapsed against a wall and sobbed like a child. The dream his grandfather had started was finished. Yet he began planning restoration the same day. The chateau would be rebuilt, not to its former glory, perhaps. Resources were limited, but it would be Rothschild property again. Occupied, maintained, preserved. He devoted the rest of his life to this single project. Friends thought him obsessed. Family members questioned his priorities. Why pour money into a French chateau when the family had properties in England that made financial sense? Why fight for Ferrières specifically? Because it mattered. Because surrender meant accepting that the Nazis had won something fundamental. Because letting the estate die meant acknowledging that all the generations of building had been pointless. Edmund couldn't accept those conclusions. So he rebuilt, room by room, year by year. The work would outlive him. His children would continue it. The house would survive. Not all family members felt the same determination. Some argued for consolidation, sell the damaged properties, focus resources on estates that had survived intact, rationalize the portfolio, accept that the era of 41 properties was finished. The post-war world wouldn't support such excess. Taxation policies were changing. Labor costs were rising. The political climate opposed vast private estates. Better to preserve a few properties perfectly than attempt to maintain a damaged network. The arguments grew bitter. Families fractured over these decisions. Brothers stopped speaking. Cousins became adversaries in legal battles over estates. The empire's collapse revealed rifts that had been hidden during prosperity. Now, with limited resources and difficult choices, the family's unity crumbled. Some properties were sold. Villa Rothschild in Gmunden went to the Austrian government. Chateau Rothschild at Boulogne destroyed during the war, wasn't rebuilt. Several smaller estates across Europe were liquidated to raise capital for restoring more significant properties. Each sale felt like betrayal to traditionalists. Each seemed like pragmatism to modernizers. The family tore itself apart, making these choices. By 1950, the empire had been reduced to approximately 15 major properties. 2/3 gone, sold, destroyed, or abandoned. The network that had connected Europe was now a scattered collection of isolated estates. The private railways were defunct. The communication systems were outdated. The vaults, once filled with gold, mostly sat empty. Insurance companies kept reserves there now. The same rooms that had held treasure now contained ledgers and policies. Yet the Rothschilds still fought. They restored what they could. They maintained what remained. They refused to disappear quietly. Guy continued his work in Paris. Victor managed Waddesdon. Edmond rebuilt Ferrières. The empire was fractured, but not finished. As long as one Rothschild stood in one mansion, the legacy persisted. The last stand wasn't glorious. It was exhausting. A grinding war of attrition against time, economics, and history itself. But the family refused to surrender completely. They would preserve something. They would maintain the name. They would ensure that future generations could point to physical structures and say, "This is where we came from. This is what we built. This is what we managed to save." The houses stood, fewer than before, damaged, diminished, but standing. And as long as they stood, the Rothschilds considered themselves undefeated. The final betrayal. In the aftermath of the war, the Rothschilds realized that even their vast fortune couldn't restore what was lost. The meeting took place in 1952 at Waddesdon Manor. 17 family members gathered in the library. The agenda was simple: make final decisions about which estates to keep and which to abandon. The conversation would determine the future of a legacy that stretched back 2 centuries. Everyone present understood they were presiding over a funeral. Baron Guy opened the discussion with financial facts. The family still possessed enormous wealth. Banking operations remained profitable. Investments had recovered from wartime losses. The Rothschilds could, theoretically, maintain most of their remaining properties. But should they? That question divided the room. The numbers told a brutal story. Ferrières required £230,000 for complete restoration. Current condition made it barely habitable. Continuing partial renovations meant perpetual inadequacy. Full restoration meant depleting reserves that could be invested elsewhere. Maintaining it long-term would cost over £60,000 annually. The estate generated no income. It was pure expense. Waddesdon needed £150,000 for deferred maintenance. Roof repairs alone would exceed £40,000. The electrical system was failing. Plumbing needed replacement throughout. Gardens required replanting after 6 years of neglect. Even after spending that fortune, annual operating costs would approach £80,000. Victor argued passionately for preservation. Others questioned the wisdom. The Austrian properties presented the clearest case for abandonment. Most were damaged beyond economic repair. Vaults had been looted. Buildings were structurally compromised. Local governments imposed taxes and regulations that made restoration prohibitively expensive. Baron Louis, who had fought so hard to maintain his Austrian empire, now advocated selling everything. Better to liquidate while buyers existed than watch the properties decay into worthlessness. The younger generation voiced opinions that shocked their elders. They questioned the entire premise of maintaining grand estates. Post-war Britain and France had different values. Conspicuous wealth drew criticism, not admiration. Income taxes made accumulating large fortunes difficult. Inheritance taxes would force future generations to sell properties simply to pay government levies. Why maintain estates that would eventually be seized through legal means? One cousin proposed converting several properties into income-producing assets. Rent Ferrières for corporate events. Open Waddesdon to paying tourists. Transform estates into businesses that generated revenue instead of consuming it. The suggestion horrified traditionalists. Rothschilds didn't rent their homes like common landlords. They didn't charge admission like carnival operators. The family's wealth had always been managed with discretion. Commercialization betrayed everything their ancestors had built. But the counter-argument carried weight. The world had changed. Discretion was becoming impossible. Tax authorities demanded detailed accounting. Post-war governments actively opposed private wealth accumulation. The estates made the family targets. Maintaining them meant accepting constant scrutiny and criticism. Converting them into businesses would at least provide cover. We're not hoarding wealth, we're operating cultural institutions. The logic was sound, even if it felt like surrender. The debate continued for 3 days. Passions ran high. Accusations flew. One family member called another a traitor for suggesting sales. The accused responded by calling his cousin delusional for believing the old world could be preserved. Voices were raised. At one point, 2 brothers nearly came to blows over Mentmore Towers. The argument wasn't really about the property. It was about competing visions of what the family should become. By the 3rd day, exhaustion forced compromise. They would maintain a core group of properties: Waddesdon, Ferrières, the Paris Mansion, perhaps 3 or 4 others. The rest would be liquidated over the next decade. Sales would be managed carefully to maximize proceeds and minimize public attention. The family would consolidate resources around estates that had the best chance of long-term survival. It wasn't the outcome anyone wanted, but it was realistic. The final betrayal came not from family members, but from governments. In 1954, Britain dramatically increased estate duties. The new rates effectively confiscated a substantial portion of inherited wealth. The Rothschilds calculated that passing Waddesdon to the next generation would cost over £1 million in taxes. The estate itself wasn't worth that much on the open market. Keeping it meant accepting financial loss for the privilege of maintaining family tradition. France implemented similar policies. Inheritance taxes on Ferrières would approach £800,000. Baron Edmund faced a choice: pay the taxes and remain relatively poor, or sell the property and remain wealthy. He chose to pay. His children thought him foolish. His friends called him sentimental. He called it honor. The estate would remain in family hands, whatever it cost. Other family members made different choices. Several Austrian properties were sold to satisfy tax obligations. Some Italian estates were donated to the government in lieu of cash payments. A Swiss chateau was converted into a hotel to generate revenue that could cover taxes and maintenance. The empire continued fragmenting. Each generation faced the same impossible choice: preserve tradition or preserve wealth. Having both became increasingly difficult. The realization hit gradually but completely. The empire as their grandparents had imagined it was finished. Not because of conquest, not because of revolution, because of mathematics. The economic model that had supported vast private estates had collapsed. Tax policy, labor costs, maintenance expenses, and social attitudes had combined to make the old system unsustainable. The Rothschilds could maintain some properties. They couldn't maintain the network. The connected empire was dead. Some family members found this acceptance liberating. They had spent their entire lives burdened by estates they neither wanted nor needed. Now, finally, they could sell without being accused of betrayal. They could pursue careers in banking, science, or art without the constant demand to manage properties. They could be wealthy individuals rather than caretakers of monuments to ancestral obsession. Others grieved deeply. For them, the estates weren't burdens. They were identity, tangible connections to ancestors who had built something extraordinary. Walking through Waddesdon or Ferrières meant walking in the footsteps of their great-grandparents. Selling these properties meant severing those connections, becoming just another wealthy family with no particular history or legacy. The loss felt personal and permanent. Baron Edmund died in 1957 at Ferrières. His last words, according to family legend, were about the chateau. Whether it looked acceptable, whether the gardens were maintained properly, whether future generations would understand what it represented. He died worried that all his work had been insufficient, that the house would fall anyway, that the dream had already ended even if the building still stood. His death marked a symbolic endpoint. The generation that had known the empire at its peak was gone. Those who remained had grown up during its decline. They had no memories of 41 estates operating in coordinated magnificence. They knew only struggle, loss, and compromise. For them, the empire was always already lost. They were simply managing the aftermath. By 1960, fewer than 10 major properties remained under direct Rothschild control. The rest had been sold, donated, or converted into corporate assets. The private railways were gone. The communication networks were obsolete. The vaults held bank documents instead of gold. What remained were beautiful buildings maintained at enormous expense for increasingly uncertain purposes. Museums of a vanished world, monuments to ambitions that had exceeded sustainability. The final betrayal wasn't that the empire fell. Empires always fall eventually. The betrayal was that it fell to something as mundane as accounting, not war, not revolution, not dramatic collapse, just the slow grinding mathematics of modern taxation and maintenance costs. The Rothschilds had survived persecution, seizure, and war. They couldn't survive inheritance taxes and labor unions. The ordinariness of it felt like mockery. All that history, all that grandeur, defeated by policy changes and rising wages. The houses stood, but the empire they represented had become fiction. Beautiful, expensive fiction that required constant effort to maintain. And even that effort couldn't preserve what mattered most: the sense of power, permanence, and family unity the estates were supposed to embody. Those were gone completely, betrayed by time, economics, and the realization that some dreams cost more than anyone can afford to pay. The mansions still stand. Despite the collapse of most of the Rothschild Empire, 10 palaces still stand as silent witnesses to a bygone era. Waddesdon Manor opens to the public on Wednesday mornings. Visitors pay £24 for admission. They walk through rooms that once hosted secret meetings between bankers and politicians. They admire art that survived wartime seizure and post-war sales. They tour gardens that require 14 full-time staff to maintain. Then they visit the gift shop, buy postcards, and drive away. None of them understand what they're really seeing. The National Trust manages the property now. The Rothschild family donated it in 1957 under arrangements that preserved family access while transferring the financial burden to a charitable organization. Clever accounting. The family maintains apartments on the upper floors. They can visit whenever they choose. But the operational costs fall to the trust. Approximately 1.2 million pounds annually, covered by admission fees, corporate events, and endowment income. The estate survives through careful management and creative financing, not through family wealth alone. Ferrières tells a similar story. The chateau stands, magnificent, impeccably maintained. But it's no longer a private residence. The French government uses it for diplomatic receptions. Foreign dignitaries stay in bedrooms where Rothschild children once slept. State dinners occupy ballrooms where family celebrations occurred. The current Baron de Rothschild retains formal title to the property, but effective control belongs to the Ministry of Culture. The family visits on special occasions. They don't live there. The house has become a national monument that happens to bear their name. The Paris mansion, Hôtel Salomon de Rothschild, operates as an art gallery and event space. The Rothschild Foundation manages it. Family members serve on the board, but the property generates revenue through exhibitions and private rentals. The Grand Ballroom, once reserved for elite social gatherings, now hosts weddings for anyone who can afford the rental fee, starting at 15,000 euros. The irony is not subtle. A place built to exclude has become commercially accessible. Democracy achieved through event planning. Other survivors cling to various states of preservation. Exbury Gardens in England remains under family management, open to the public for admission fees. 700 acres, 5 million flowering plants, over 30 staff maintaining Victorian horticultural ambitions for 21st century tourists. The property breaks even financially, barely. The family subsidizes shortfalls from other income sources. Why? Because it's beautiful. Because it represents history. Because letting it fail feels like final surrender. Château de Prigny in Switzerland remains private. The family actually lives there. No tours, no commercial events. True private residence in the old Ging tradition. But it's the exception. The survival strategy involved consolidating resources, selling almost everything else to maintain this one property properly. The Rothschilds accepted that they couldn't preserve the network. They chose quality over quantity. One perfect estate rather than a dozen compromised ones. Villa Efroussi in the south of France passed to distant relatives. They faced choices the Rothschilds understood intimately. Maintain it privately and accept enormous costs, or open it commercially and compromise exclusivity. They chose a hybrid approach. Private residence 6 months annually, luxury hotel rental the other 6 months. Daily rates exceed 5,000 euros. The house pays for itself by temporarily becoming someone else's fantasy. The Rothschilds no longer control it, but at least it survives. Some properties disappeared entirely from family hands. Mentmore Towers was sold in 1977. The contents auctioned. 7 days of sales. Over 5,000 lots. Furniture, art, books, and personal items dispersed to collectors worldwide. The building itself became a religious center. The empire that Baron Mayer built in 1855 dissolved in a week of hammer strikes. Each sold item represented a piece of family history scattered beyond recovery. The Austrian estates are mostly gone, some demolished, some converted to institutional uses. Baron Louis's industrial empire, signed away to secure his freedom, never returned to family control. The properties he built are warehouses now, office buildings, government facilities, anonymous structures that reveal no hint of their origins. Walking past them, You'd never know a Rothschild had once ruled from these places. Current family members maintain complicated relationships with the surviving estates. They're proud, certainly. These buildings represent extraordinary achievement. But they're also burdensome. Every property requires attention, financial support, decision, making about maintenance and use. The younger generation questions whether preservation serves any purpose beyond nostalgia. Why maintain monuments to 19th century excess when capital could fund contemporary causes? Yet they continue. 21st century Rothschilds still attend events at Waddesdon. They still maintain connections to properties that bear their name. They understand these estates are more than buildings. They're physical embodiments of family history. Letting them collapse would mean severing connections to ancestors who built something unprecedented. So they preserve, they donate, they subsidize, they do what's necessary to keep the remaining properties functioning. The 10 surviving estates represent less than a quarter of the original empire. But they're the best quarter, the properties most likely to endure. Waddesdon has institutional support. Ferrières has government backing. Exbury generates income. Pregny is maintained through private wealth. These aren't accidents. They're the result of 70 years of strategic retreat, choosing which hills to defend, surrendering positions that couldn't be held, preserving what mattered most. Visitors to these properties rarely grasp what they're seeing. They admire beauty. They appreciate history. They don't understand the cost, not just the money spent on tickets and maintenance, the emotional cost, the compromises, the family arguments, the difficult decisions about what to preserve and what to abandon. The estates look serene, unchanging, permanent, but they're maintained through constant effort and repeated choices to keep fighting for their survival. The mansions stand because people decided they should stand. That decision is renewed annually. Every budget review, every maintenance discussion, every board meeting. The buildings don't survive through inertia. They survive through will. The will of people who believe history matters. That beauty matters, that preserving connections to the past serves some purpose beyond nostalgia. Whether that purpose justifies the cost remains debatable. But the mansions stand, scarred, diminished, compromised, but standing. And as long as they stand, the Rothschild Empire isn't entirely dead. It's transformed, reduced, no longer what it was, but still present, still visible, still bearing witness to ambitions that reshaped Europe. What power does beauty hold? The Rothschilds created not just palaces, but the very idea of beauty and power intertwined. Stand in the ballroom at Ferrières and look up. The ceiling rises 12 meters, covered in gold leaf, painted with mythological scenes by artists whose names filled 19th century exhibition catalogs. Light from crystal chandeliers reflects off surfaces designed to make wealth visible. Every detail calculated for effect. This wasn't decoration, this was communication. A visual language that said, "We possess resources beyond your comprehension. We operate on a scale you cannot match. We are power made tangible." The question is whether that communication still works, whether beauty divorced from actual power retains meaning. The Rothschilds are still wealthy, but they're not uniquely wealthy anymore. Silicon Valley billionaires make their 19th century predecessors look quaint. Sovereign wealth funds control resources that dwarf old banking fortunes. The scale has shifted. Yet these estates still project authority. Why? Because beauty transcends economics. The ballroom at Ferrières is objectively magnificent regardless of who owns it or how wealthy they are. The gardens at Waddesdon create experiences that money can't replicate in other forms. You can't download perfect horticultural design. You can't stream the sensation of standing in a room where art and architecture merge into something greater than the sum of expensive parts. The estates created beauty that persists independent of the wealth that created them. But beauty at this scale came with costs that extended beyond finance. Creating these properties required exploitation. Servants worked crushing hours for minimal wages. Craftsmen died in construction accidents. Quarries were exhausted. Forests were cleared. The beauty we admire was built on suffering we conveniently forget. Should we celebrate the outcome while ignoring the process? The question has no comfortable answer. The Rothschilds themselves struggled with this tension. They were cultured people, educated, interested in art and philosophy. They understood beauty's value beyond mere display. Many were genuine patrons who supported artists and advanced cultural development. But they also understood that beauty served power, that magnificent estates impressed rivals and intimidated competitors, that hosting events in overwhelming surroundings tilted negotiations in their favor. They used beauty as a weapon. Does that corrupt the beauty itself? Consider the art collections. The Rothschilds assembled masterpieces, Rembrandt paintings that had hung in royal palaces, manuscripts that documented human thought across centuries, sculptures that represented the finest work of legendary artists. This art was preserved, protected, maintained by experts. Is that better or worse than having it accessible in public museums? The Rothschilds kept beauty private, but they also kept it safe. The trade-off isn't simple. The estates influenced European taste for generations. Architectural styles copied from Rothschild properties appeared across the continent. Garden designs pioneered at Expiry were replicated in parks and private homes. The family's aesthetic choices became standards that others tried to match. They didn't just possess beauty, they defined it. That's a different kind of power, more subtle than economic control, perhaps more lasting. Today, the surviving estates serve educational purposes their builders never intended. Architecture students study their construction techniques. Art historians examine their collections. Horticulturalists research their gardens. The properties generate knowledge that benefits people who will never own anything comparable. The private empire has been partially democratized through scholarship and public access. Is that redemption or just transformation? The philosophical question cuts deeper. If beauty requires such resources that only the extremely wealthy can create it at this scale, does that make beauty inherently elitist? Or does it mean that certain forms of beauty require concentration of resources to exist at all? No collective committee would have built Waddesdon. No public institution would have assembled the Ferrières art collection. These achievements required individual obsession, backed by personal wealth. We benefit from them now. But we couldn't have created them democratically. The alternative isn't obviously better. Destroy the estates and you destroy irreplaceable beauty. Maintain them privately and you preserve elitism. Open them publicly but charge admission and you commercialize what was meant to be pristine. There's no clean solution. Every option involves compromise. The Rothschilds created this problem by building on a scale that transcended reasonable necessity. We inherit the problem without the wealth that might make it manageable. Yet people keep visiting. Over 300,000 annually at Waddesdon alone. They pay admission. They follow guided tours. They buy souvenirs. Why? Not because they're interested in the Rothschild family specifically, because they're drawn to beauty that exceeds normal experience. The estates offer escape into worlds more magnificent than daily life provides. That desire crosses economic and social boundaries. Everyone wants to briefly inhabit spaces that inspire awe. Beauty holds power because it affects us physically. Heart rates change in magnificent spaces. Breathing deepens. Perspective shifts. The experience isn't intellectual, it's visceral. The Rothschilds understood this. They built environments that overwhelmed visitors. That made arguments against their interests seem somehow smaller. You can't negotiate hard with someone while you're stunned by your surroundings. Beauty disarms. It was always meant to. The legacy is complicated. These estates represent extraordinary artistic achievement. They also represent excess on scales that contributed to social inequalities that sparked revolutions. They preserved culture. They hoarded resources. They advanced aesthetics. They embodied privilege. All simultaneously, all inseparably. We can't separate the beauty from the system that created it. We're left appreciating masterpieces while acknowledging they're products of structures we claim to oppose. Perhaps that contradiction is the point. Perhaps the estates teach us that human achievement is always morally complicated, that great beauty can emerge from questionable systems, that progress and exploitation often advance together. The Rothschilds didn't intend this lesson, but their empire provides it anyway. Beauty holds power, but that power is never pure, never simple, never free from the costs required to create it. The mansions force us to confront questions we'd rather avoid, about wealth, about access, about who gets to create and who merely gets to admire, about whether preserving beauty justifies the systems that made it possible. The estates stand as monuments to artistic achievement and economic inequality, to cultural advancement and social injustice, to human capability and human cruelty. They're all these things. We're left deciding which aspects deserve emphasis. The buildings can't make that choice for us. They just stand, beautiful, troubling, impossible to dismiss or fully embrace. The cost of dreams. In the end, the Rothschilds' empire was both their triumph and their tragedy. The last of the original 41 estates still under family control celebrated its 150th anniversary in 2020. Fewer than 50 people attended, mostly elderly Rothschilds, some historians, a photographer documenting the event for archives. No press, no public ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement that something built with such ambition had survived long enough to become genuinely historical. The day was gray. Rain threatened but never quite arrived. Someone gave a short speech about preservation and legacy. Then everyone went home. That's how empires end now. Not with dramatic collapse, but with modest gatherings that barely register. What did the Rothschilds achieve? They built beauty that endures. They preserved art that enriches culture. They advanced architectural and horticultural practices that influence generations. They created spaces that still inspire awe over a century after their construction. These aren't minor accomplishments. They're genuine contributions to human civilization. But what did they sacrifice? Family relationships strained to breaking. Personal health ruined by stress, ethical compromises that financed wars and prolonged conflicts, massive resources devoted to private pleasure that could have addressed public suffering, generations trapped by obligations to maintain estates they never asked for. The cost wasn't just financial, it was human, deep, permanent. Could they have chosen differently? Built fewer estates, maintained them more modestly, used wealth for purposes beyond personal legacy? Perhaps, but the Rothschilds were products of their era. They operated according to values that their world rewarded: discretion, accumulation, dynastic thinking, building for posterity. These weren't unusual priorities. The Rothschilds simply executed them with unusual success. Their mistake, if it was a mistake, was succeeding too completely, building so much that maintaining it became impossible. The empire taught brutal lessons about permanence. Nothing lasts. Not wealth, not power, not even physical structures, if the will to preserve them weakens. The Rothschilds thought they were building for centuries. Many estates barely survived 2 generations. The dream of permanent legacy proved illusory. Time, politics, and economics eventually overwhelm everything. The only question is how long the struggle lasts. Some family members express relief that the empire contracted. They live normal lives now. Wealthy, certainly, but not burdened by estates requiring constant attention. They work in fields they chose. They live in homes they wanted. They're free from obligations that consumed their grandparents. For them, the empire's collapse was liberation. They don't mourn what was lost. They celebrate what they gained through loss. Others grieve deeply. They visit the surviving estates and see ghosts, ancestors who built these places, family members who fought to preserve them, servants who devoted lives to maintenance. The history presses on them. They feel responsibility to continue what previous generations started, not because it makes financial sense, because letting it die feels like betrayal. These Rothschilds remain trapped by legacy. They'll spend their lives maintaining monuments to dreams they didn't dream. The broader question transcends the Rothschilds specifically. What do we owe to ambitions of previous generations? Must we preserve what they built simply because they built it? Or are we free to make our own choices regardless of family legacy? The surviving estates force these questions practically. Every budget meeting, every maintenance discussion, someone must decide whether to spend limited resources preserving the past or addressing the present. The right answer isn't obvious. Public memory of the Rothschild Empire is fragmenting. Older generations remember the name carrying weight. Younger people barely recognize it. The estates that remain are famous as places, not as Rothschild properties. Visitors tour Waddesdon without understanding whose vision created it. The family has been separated from their achievement. In one sense, that's tragic. They built these places. History should remember that. In another sense, it's appropriate. The estates have transcended their creators. They belong to culture now more than to any family. What remains of the hidden empire? Beautiful buildings maintained at enormous cost, art collections scattered across museums and private holdings, historical records documenting financial and political influence, lessons about the limits of wealth and the illusions of permanence. That's the inheritance. Less than the Rothschilds hope to leave. More than many families achieve. Ambiguous, complicated, impossible to summarize neatly. The cost of their dream included the dream itself. By building on such a scale, the Rothschilds created obligations that eventually exceeded their capacity to fulfill. The empire became trap as much as achievement. Later generations inherited responsibilities they couldn't escape, but couldn't fully embrace. They're left managing decline, choosing which pieces to preserve and which to abandon. It's not the legacy anyone would choose, but it's the legacy they received. If you walk through a surviving Rothschild estate today, pay attention to the empty spaces. Rooms that were once filled with family are now crossed by tourists with cameras. Gardens that required armies of staff are maintained by skeleton crews. Vaults that held wealth now store documents. The absence is as important as what remains. The estates are monuments not just to what was built, but to what couldn't be sustained. The Rothschild Mansion Empire proves that success and failure aren't opposites. They're stages in the same process. The family succeeded beyond any reasonable measure. They also failed in ways that only extreme success makes possible. They built too much. They created a legacy too heavy to carry. Their triumph contained the seeds of their decline. That's not unusual. That's how most empires work. They grow until growth itself becomes fatal. The final question is whether it was worth it. The costs were enormous. The suffering was real. The compromises were profound. But the beauty persists. The estates that survived still inspire. The art they preserved still enriches. The gardens still bloom. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps creating beauty that outlasts your ability to control it is its own form of success. Perhaps the Rothschilds' real achievement was building things that could survive without them, even if survival meant transformation they never intended. The mansions stand, fewer than they built, different than they imagined, but standing, bearing witness to dreams that cost everything and achieved something. We can judge those dreams. We should examine their costs. But we can't deny they existed. The buildings ensure that. They're monuments to the dangerous allure of building beyond necessity, to the seduction of leaving permanent marks, to the human desire to create beauty that transcends mortal limitations. The Rothschild Mansion Empire was excessive, ethically complicated, financially unsustainable, and genuinely magnificent. That's the cost of dreams. They require everything. They deliver less than promised. But what they deliver can still matter, can still inspire, can still stand after everything else has fallen. The Rothschilds paid the price. We inherit the ruins. And somehow, impossibly, the ruins are still beautiful.